They murdered the parents in front of their children. Then they spared the children, because according to their doctrine, anyone under the age of 8 was innocent. This was the twisted logic of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. An execution disguised as a battle, a slaughter justified by faith, and a dark secret protected by the very leaders who preached piety to the world. The lies began the moment the shooting stopped. To understand how a grassy field in Utah became an execution ground, you have to go back decades. You have to understand a people who felt they were chosen by God and persecuted by man. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the Mormons, was born in 1830 from the visions of a prophet named Joseph Smith. From the very beginning, they were outsiders. Their beliefs, including the divine origin of the Book of Mormon, put them at odds with their neighbors. They were hounded out of Ohio and driven from Missouri. For a brief time, they found a fragile peace in Nauvoo, Illinois, a city they built from scratch on a swampy bend of the Mississippi River. But their growing numbers, political unity, and the secret practice of polygamy stoked old fears. In 1844, the peace shattered when a mob stormed a jail and murdered Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram. With their prophet martyred, the movement turned to a new leader, a man of unshakable will named Brigham Young. Young knew that his people would never be safe inside the United States. They needed their own kingdom, a sanctuary so remote that the federal government couldn't touch them. So in 1847, he led the first wave of pioneers on a grueling 1,000-mile trek into the empty heart of the continent, to the Great Salt Lake Valley. This was more than a search for religious freedom. It was a strategic relocation. The brutal, unforgiving isolation of the desert was the entire point. Here, in what they called their New Zion, Young could finally build his perfect society, a theocracy where the Word of God was the only law that mattered, far from the reach of mobs and meddling politicians. When the Mormons arrived, the land was a blank slate. It belonged to Mexico, but Mexico City was a world away. Brigham Young moved quickly to establish his own nation. He drew up plans for a massive state he called Deseret, a name from the Book of Mormon signifying the honeybee. This wasn't some backwater settlement. It was a proposed empire covering all of modern Utah and Nevada, with huge portions of Arizona, California, Oregon, and Colorado. Washington, however, had other ideas. After the Mexican-American War, the land became U.S. property, and Congress had no intention of granting a religious leader a state larger than Texas. As a compromise, they created the Utah Territory in 1850. Then, in a stroke of political pragmatism that would backfire spectacularly, President Millard Fillmore appointed Brigham Young its first governor. This created a powder keg. For several years, Young was both the prophet of God and the official representative of the U.S. government. In Utah, there was no line between church and state because, as far as the Mormons were concerned, there was no need for one. Disputes were settled by local bishops, not federal judges, and Young ruled his territory with absolute authority, accountable only to God. It was a functioning theocracy hidden inside a U.S. territory, but back east, whispers turned into headlines. Newspapers, fueled by disgruntled officials who had fled the territory, painted Brigham Young as a religious tyrant, a despot ruling a rogue state in defiance of American values. The friction between Utah and Washington wasn't just about political power, it was a culture war. The practice of polygamy, or plural marriage, which the church had openly announced, became a national scandal. Politicians and preachers denounced it as a relic of barbarism, lumping it in with slavery as a moral stain on the nation. For their part, the Mormons felt entirely justified. They believed they were persecuted for their faith and held a deep resentment for the government. They professed love for the U.S. Constitution, but, as one leader famously declared, they despised the damned rascals who ran the country. They were a people who felt pushed into a corner, and they were ready to push back. This simmering conflict exploded in 1856 during a period of intense religious revival known as the Mormon Reformation. Young and other leaders delivered fiery sermons, calling the faithful to purge sin from their lives and renew their covenants. The rhetoric grew hotter, more extreme, and more dangerous. A dark and controversial doctrine was given new emphasis: blood atonement. This was the belief that some sins, like apostasy, were so severe that the sacrifice of Jesus Christ was not enough to save the sinner's soul. The only way to cleanse such a stain was for the sinner's own blood to be spilled upon the earth. While the modern church insists this was only a metaphor, historians point to the chilling sermons of the era and argue that for many believers, including Brigham Young, it was meant as a literal, terrifying reality. It created a climate where killing an enemy of the church could be seen as an act of mercy. By the spring of 1857, President James Buchanan had had enough. He saw the situation in Utah as an open rebellion. He fired Brigham Young as governor, appointed a non-Mormon named Alfred Cumming to replace him, and ordered an army of 2,500 soldiers to march to Utah to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. This act, meant to assert federal authority, was seen by Young as a declaration of war. This was the persecution he had been prophesying for years. His enemies were finally coming to destroy them. Young's response was swift and defiant. He declared martial law across the Utah Territory. He ordered his militia, the rebuilt Nauvoo Legion, to prepare for a scorched earth campaign. They were to harass the approaching army, burn the grasslands before them, and destroy forts in their path. He whipped his followers into a religious frenzy, warning of traitors within and armies without. He sent riders south, instructing local leaders like John D. Lee to ensure their Native American allies would fight alongside them against the American invaders. It was into this cauldron of apocalyptic fear, religious fervor, and paranoia that the Baker-Fancher party, a wagon train of families dreaming of California, unknowingly took their first steps. They had no idea they were walking into a holy war. While Brigham Young was preparing for Armageddon, the Baker-Fancher party was simply trying to get to California. They set out from Arkansas in the 18th of April 57, a well-organized and prosperous collection of families. Led by the experienced Alexander Fancher and John Baker, the group was comprised of about 25 core families, their hired hands, and a massive herd of nearly 1,000 cattle. They were pioneers, not soldiers, and as they made their way west, they remained completely oblivious to the fact that the Utah Territory had become a virtual war zone. They were walking into a conflict they didn't know existed, against a people who had already decided they were the enemy. The timing could not have been worse. Just a month after the party left Arkansas, a prominent Mormon apostle named Parley Pratt was murdered in that same state by the estranged husband of one of his plural wives. The wagon train had absolutely nothing to do with it. They were hundreds of miles away when it happened and likely didn't even know who Pratt was. But in the charged atmosphere of Utah, details didn't matter. When the immigrants arrived in Salt Lake City in early August, news of the murder had just arrived, and the locals were simmering with rage. The people from Arkansas were immediately viewed with suspicion and hostility. They were not just travelers, they were representatives of the state where a beloved leader had been slain. The reception in Salt Lake City was brutally cold. The immigrants needed to restock on grain and supplies for the final, punishing leg of their journey across the desert. They were refused at every turn. Brigham Young, preparing for his war with the U.S. Army, had ordered his followers to hoard their food and supplies, not to trade with outsiders. This policy was compounded by a thirst for vengeance. The Mormons openly treated the travelers with contempt, threatening them and refusing to sell them even basic necessities. They were seen as complicit in Pratt's murder, simply because of their home state. Rumors also began to fly that some in the party were wildcats, a nickname for Missourians who had taken part in the violent anti-Mormon persecutions nearly 2 decades earlier. There was no truth to these claims, but truth was in short supply. As the wagon train was forced to move on, a narrative began to form around them, a collection of stories that painted them as arrogant, abusive, and blasphemous. These tales, which would later be used to justify the massacre, accused the emigrants of endless provocations. They were said to have insulted Mormon women, calling them whores for their polygamous marriages. They were accused of boasting that they had helped kill Joseph Smith. When denied supplies, they allegedly let their cattle trample Mormon fields and tear down fences. The most infamous story claimed they had deliberately poisoned a spring or a dead ox, causing the deaths of local Native Americans. These accusations provided a convenient excuse, painting the emigrants as wicked sinners who deserved whatever was coming to them. It is crucial to view these accusations with extreme skepticism. As historian Will Bagley notes, nearly every account of the emigrants' bad behavior comes from the very people who later participated in their murder or the subsequent cover-up. It was a classic case of blaming the victim. While there may have been moments of tension or frustration from a wagon train being denied basic supplies, the idea of a widespread campaign of abuse from a group made up largely of women and children is highly suspect. It was a smear campaign designed to retroactively justify an atrocity. They were being set up as villains in a story whose ending had already been decided. Forced out of Salt Lake City, the Baker-Fancher party began the long, difficult journey south, hoping to find supplies in the smaller Mormon settlements along the route. But the hostility followed them. In town after town, from Provo to Cedar City, they were met with the same closed doors and suspicious glares. Their resources dwindled, and their options narrowed. Finally, in the first week of September, they reached a place called Mountain Meadows. It was a well-known oasis on the Old Spanish Trail, a beautiful, lush valley with abundant water and grass. For the weary travelers, it must have felt like salvation. Here, they could finally rest, let their 1,000-head herd graze and regain strength, and prepare themselves for the final desert crossing into California. On Sunday, the 6th of September, they held a church service. The men gathered wood, the women mended clothes, and the children played among the wagons, blissfully unaware that in the hills above them, another group of men was gathering with a very different purpose. While the Fancher party rested in the meadows below, a different kind of meeting was taking place in the settlements nearby. The plan to destroy them was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a calculated decision made by the highest levels of local Mormon leadership. At the center of it all was a man named John D. Lee. Lee was the embodiment of Mormon devotion and frontier toughness. A convert since 1838, he had been a close friend of Joseph Smith and was later adopted as a son by Brigham Young himself under a church sealing ritual. He was a man of status, with 19 wives and a reputation for getting things done. Crucially, Lee was also a former member of the Danites, a secret fraternity of Mormon enforcers. He was a man who understood orders and believed unquestioningly in the authority of his prophet. The plan relied on using local Paiute warriors as both the primary attackers and the eventual scapegoats. For years, Brigham Young had pursued a strategic policy of building alliances with native tribes, seeing them as a potential buffer against the United States government. He thought the Paiutes could be a key ally in the coming war with the U.S. Army. For the Paiutes, the motivation was less clear. But the promise of plundering the emigrants' huge herd of cattle and their rumored chests of gold was a powerful incentive. The Mormon leaders leveraged this alliance, convincing the warriors to join them in an attack on the wagon train, framing the emigrants as enemies who deserved to be punished. The decision did not come from John D. Lee alone. The real shot callers in southern Utah were Isaac C. Haight, the mayor of Cedar City and a former bodyguard to Joseph Smith, and his superior, Colonel William H. Dame, the highest-ranking militia commander in the region. These men held absolute authority, both in the church and in the territorial militia. Weeks before the wagon train arrived, a very important visitor had toured their settlements. George A. Smith, an apostle and Brigham Young's own cousin. According to John D. Lee's later testimony, it was Smith who delivered the thinly veiled order. In a private meeting, Smith allegedly told Lee that the Fancher party should be used up and that he hoped they would not be allowed to pass through the territory safely. For a man like Lee, an instruction from a man he considered Brigham Young's personal envoy was as good as a direct command from the prophet. He later stated he left that meeting with a very clear understanding of his duty. He viewed the order as sacred, something to be obeyed without question or hesitation. He believed George A. Smith had been sent south by Brigham Young for the specific purpose of preparing the people for the destruction of the wagon train. The stage was set. The justification had been provided from the very top of the church hierarchy, or so the men on the ground were led to believe. With this implicit authorization, the local leaders convened a secret council at Colonel Dame's home in Parowan. At this meeting, sometimes called the Tan Bark Council, the fate of the emigrants was debated. The plotters, including Dame, Haight, and another bishop named Philip Klingensmith, weighed their options. Initially, they decided that no matter what happened, they would spare the youngest children, those considered too innocent to tell tales. But Isaac Haight reportedly objected, arguing with chilling logic that if they were going to do it, they should kill them all, stating that nits make lice. Bishop Klingensmith agreed. They decided to send a fast rider, James Haslam, to Salt Lake City to get Brigham Young's final, official word on the matter. But Isaac Haight had no intention of waiting. After the council broke up, he held a second, more secretive meeting with men he considered loyal and ruthless. The official plan to wait for the prophet's reply was a sham. At this new meeting, they finalized the details of the attack. They would incite the Paiutes to lead the charge, and the local Mormon militia would join in, disguised as natives, to ensure the job was finished. The blame would fall squarely on the Indians. Shortly after, Haight sent a message south, giving John D. Lee his direct orders to proceed. The attack was greenlit. The decision was made. All that was left was for Lee to carry it out. On the night of the 10th of September, after days of a failed siege, Lee gathered his men. They knelt and prayed for divine guidance, then held a vote. Every man present agreed. The emigrants had to be killed. As Lee would later confess, he believed it was his religious duty, a necessary act of war for God's chosen people to claim their rightful place in the world. The attack began at dawn on Monday, the 7th of September. The families of the Baker-Fancher party were just finishing breakfast, preparing for another day of rest, when the first volley of gunfire ripped through their camp. A child fell. Then another man. Chaos erupted as Mormon militiamen and their Paiute allies, who had been hiding in the ravines and brush, unleashed a torrent of fire. In the first few minutes, 7 men were killed and nearly 20 more were wounded, including both wagon train leaders, Baker and Fancher. The attackers, who had expected an easy victory, were confident the camp would fold immediately. They were wrong. The emigrants, though caught by surprise, were resilient and well armed. They quickly rallied, returning fire with deadly accuracy while scrambling to pull their wagons into a tight defensive circle. The initial assault was a failure. The Mormon plan, which relied on the Paiutes doing most of the fighting, fell apart when the emigrants fought back so fiercely. Several Paiute warriors were killed in the first exchange, and their enthusiasm for the fight quickly soured. When John D. Lee urged them to charge the camp again, many of them simply gathered their dead and wounded and went home. The Mormon militia, some of whom had painted their faces to look like their native allies, were now left to handle a situation that was spiraling out of their control. The wagon train had transformed their camp into a makeshift fort, digging rifle pits in the center and reinforcing the gaps between the wagons. What was supposed to be a quick, brutal ambush had just turned into a long, drawn-out siege. For the next 4 days, the two sides were locked in a stalemate. The standoff was punctuated by sporadic sniper fire. The emigrants were well protected inside their fortifications, but they had one critical vulnerability: water. The camp was situated a short distance from a spring, but any attempt to get to it drew immediate fire from the hills. They were trapped. As the days wore on, their situation became increasingly desperate. The September sun beat down on the valley, and their water barrels ran dry. The wounded, suffering terribly without water to drink or clean their injuries, began to die. The air inside the wagon circle grew thick with the smell of death and decay. Their food supplies dwindled, and more importantly, so did their ammunition. Inside the camp, hope was dying. Outside the camp, the attackers were growing impatient. John D. Lee, realizing he couldn't take the camp by force without exposing his own men and revealing their identity, sent urgent messages to Isaac Haight in Cedar City, begging for reinforcements. Haight dispatched dozens more militiamen to the Meadows. The net was tightening. Meanwhile, far to the north, the express rider sent days earlier finally reached Brigham Young with the news of the standoff. The prophet's reply, scribbled on a letter, was clear. Do not interfere with the emigrants. Let them go in peace. But by the time that letter began its journey south, it was already too late. It would not arrive in time to stop what was about to happen. By Thursday, after another failed assault, the Mormon leadership realized their plan was a complete disaster. They couldn't win the fight, but they also couldn't just walk away. Too many people knew what had happened. They were committed. If the emigrants survived and reached California, they would tell everyone that they had been attacked not by Indians, but by white Mormon settlers. The entire conspiracy would be exposed. So, John D. Lee and the others concocted a new plan, one that relied not on bullets, but on betrayal. They would offer a truce. Late on Friday, the 11th of September, the besieged emigrants saw a sight that must have felt like a miracle. A small group of white men approaching their camp, one of them carrying a white flag. The families inside the wagon circle erupted in cheers. For 5 days, they believed they had been fighting off a savage Indian attack. Now, it seemed, their fellow Americans had arrived to rescue them. John D. Lee rode into the camp and presented himself as a captain in the local militia who had just arrived. He told them a story. He said he had spoken with the Indians and had managed to negotiate terms for their safe passage. The Paiutes, he claimed, were angry and would not let the emigrants leave with their weapons or property. But if the families would surrender all their firearms to him for safekeeping and abandon their wagons and cattle, he could personally escort them safely back to Cedar City. It was an offer that sounded too good to be true, and for some, it raised immediate suspicion. The dying Captain Fancher reportedly warned his people against it. But what choice did they have? They were out of water, almost out of ammunition, and surrounded. To stay meant certain death. To trust the man with the white flag was their only glimmer of hope. In their desperation, they agreed to the terms. They handed over their rifles, sealing their fate. With the emigrants disarmed, the final gruesome act of the plan began. The survivors were separated into 3 groups, a division designed to prevent any last-minute resistance. The first group consisted of the youngest children, those under the age of 8, along with the most severely wounded men. They were placed into 2 wagons and sent down the trail first, ostensibly to lead the way to Cedar City. This small act of mercy was a lie, designed to get the innocents out of sight before the killing started. Following a short distance behind them was the second group, made up of all the women and older children, walking together. The last group, bringing up the rear, was comprised of the remaining men. They were forced to walk in a single file line, with an armed Mormon militiaman marching beside each one, like an honor guard leading them to their execution. The procession walked in eerie silence for about a mile. The emigrants, relieved to be on the move and away from the siege, likely felt a fragile sense of hope. The wagons carrying the small children passed over a slight rise in the terrain and disappeared from view. This was the signal. Major John Higbee, the militia commander on the scene, raised his arm and gave the chillingly simple order, "Do your duty." In that instant, every Mormon guard turned on the unarmed man walking next to him and fired his weapon at point-blank range. The executions were swift and brutally efficient. Within seconds, the entire column of emigrant men lay dead or dying on the trail. Before the women and children in the second group could even register what had happened, the rest of the killers erupted from their hiding places in the surrounding brush. The remaining Mormon militiamen and their Paiute allies fell upon the terrified group with rifles, knives, and clubs. The carefully orchestrated execution descended into a scene of utter carnage. According to the testimony of those who were there, the entire massacre was over in less than 3 minutes. 120 men, women, and older children were slaughtered. Some were shot, others were clubbed to death, and many had their throats cut from ear to ear. The horror was absolute. Later accounts told of a young girl who survived the initial onslaught and ran to a young militiaman, begging for her life. The man, moved by a brief flicker of mercy, declared he would save her. But his father, one of the massacre's leaders and believed by many to be John D. Lee himself, stepped forward and stabbed the girl through the heart while his son held her. Other witnesses recalled seeing small children clinging to the knees of the murderers, pleading to be spared and offering to be slaves for life, only to be killed as well. In perhaps the most depraved account, 2 teenage girls were allegedly promised their lives if they would strip and dance naked for the men. They did as they were told, and as soon as they were finished, they were murdered like all the others. When the killing finally stopped, only 17 people remained alive, the small children who had been in the lead wagons. They were spared because their Mormon executioners deemed them to be below the age of innocence, too young to be accountable for their parents' supposed sins, and, more practically, too young to serve as credible witnesses. One of those children, Christopher Fancher, later gave a simple, devastating testimony. "Father was killed by the Indians," he said. "When they washed their faces, they were white." After the slaughter, Lee gathered the surviving militia members and forced them to kneel in a circle. They swore a blood oath of secrecy, vowing to blame the entire affair on the Paiutes and to kill anyone who ever spoke the truth of what they had done. The cover-up began immediately, but so did the looting. The militia members swarmed over the bodies, stripping them of clothing and anything of value. They ransacked the wagons, collecting the emigrants' property and possessions. The spoils were divided systematically. The gold and valuables were reportedly sent north to the church's tithing house in Salt Lake City. The 1,000 head of cattle were branded with the church's crossed irons mark and were also driven north to be added to the church herds, save for a few that John D. Lee kept for himself. The captured rifles and guns were distributed among the militiamen. Nothing was wasted. The dark secret was sealed, and the murderers walked away with their victims' wealth. For nearly 2 years, the bodies of the 120 victims of the Mountain Meadows Massacre lay unburied, left to the sun and the scavengers. The secret held, but a crime of that magnitude could not stay hidden forever. In 1859, a detachment of U.S. soldiers under the command of Major James Carleton was sent to investigate. What they found was a scene of unparalleled horror. Carleton described the valley as a ghastly, silent field of death. The skeletal remains of men, women, and children were scattered across the landscape. He noted the chillingly personal evidence of the slaughter. Women's hair, torn from their scalps, still tangled in the sagebrush, fragments of children's dresses fluttering in the wind. And everywhere, the sun-bleached bones and skulls of those who had been so brutally murdered. The scene was so horrific that his hardened soldiers, men accustomed to the violence of the frontier, were visibly shaken. Carleton and his men gathered what remains they could find and buried them in a mass grave. Over it, they erected a 12-foot-high stone cairn. Atop the mound of rocks, they placed a large wooden cross made from local cedar. On the crossbeam, they carved the words, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord." It was a solemn monument to the dead and a stark warning to the living. The story goes that sometime later, Brigham Young himself visited the site. Upon seeing the cross and its inscription, he allegedly remarked to his companions, "Vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little," before ordering the monument to be torn down. Whether the quote is apocryphal or not, the cross was indeed destroyed, a symbolic act of erasing a history that the church leadership wanted desperately to forget. Meanwhile, the 17 surviving children who had been living with local Mormon families were finally located by the federal government and returned to their relatives in Arkansas. In a final, audacious act, Brigham Young sent the U.S. government a bill for their room and board. For more than a decade, no one was held accountable for the massacre. The investigation stalled, pushed aside by the nation's preoccupation with the looming Civil War. But in the 1870s, the case was reopened, largely thanks to one man deciding his soul was worth more than his oath of secrecy. Philip Clingman Smith, the former bishop who had participated in the planning and the killing, came forward and confessed everything. His testimony broke the case wide open, and for the first time, arrest warrants were issued for the men he named as the ringleaders: William Dame, Isaac Haight, John Higbee, and John D. Lee. Dame and Haight went into hiding, living as fugitives for the rest of their lives. Higbee also fled. Only one man was brought to trial: John D. Lee. Lee's legal battle was a masterclass in frontier justice and political maneuvering. His first trial, in 1875, ended with a hung jury. The prosecution had made the strategic mistake of trying to link the massacre all the way up the chain of command to Brigham Young. The Mormon heavy jury refused to convict, unwilling to implicate their prophet. For the second trial, the prosecution changed its strategy. This time, they focused solely on Lee, painting him as the fanatical, bloodthirsty leader of the entire affair. They made him the villain, conveniently ignoring the roles of his superiors. This time, the all-Mormon jury convicted him of first-degree murder. The message was clear. The church was willing to sacrifice one man to protect the reputation of its leadership. John D. Lee was officially designated as the scapegoat. On the 23rd of March, 1877, 20 years after the massacre, he was taken back to Mountain Meadows. He was seated on the edge of his own coffin, and in front of the execution site, he was put to death by a firing squad. Lee never denied his involvement, but to his dying day, he insisted he was not the sole author of the crime. He was a loyal soldier following orders. In his memoirs, published after his death, he laid the blame squarely on his superiors. He stated plainly that he believed he was carrying out a religious duty, a task given to him by men speaking for God. He claimed his direct orders came from Isaac Haight and William Dame, and he was adamant that the initial command had come from the church's highest echelons via the visit from Apostle George A. Smith. Lee believed Smith was sent by Brigham Young specifically to arrange for the emigrants' destruction. Lee was executed for his part in the crime, but the question of who else was guilty would haunt history for the next century and a half. The most enduring controversy of the Mountain Meadows Massacre is the role of Brigham Young. Did the powerful prophet order the killing of 120 innocent people? The debate rages to this day. Historians like Will Bagley, author of the definitive book Blood of the Prophets, argue that the evidence for his complicity is overwhelming. They point to the fact that Young's violent rhetoric against outsiders and his sermons on blood atonement created the climate of fanatical hatred necessary for such an atrocity. They argue that the command from his cousin George A. Smith to use up the emigrants was a clear, albeit deniable, order. Furthermore, Young's behavior after the fact was not that of an innocent man. He made no effort to bring the killers to justice, he sheltered them for years, he never returned the stolen property, and he actively participated in the cover-up. On the other side, defenders of Young, including some LDS historians, argue that there is no smoking gun. They point to the letter Young wrote during the siege, the one that arrived too late, in which he explicitly told his followers to let the emigrants pass in peace. They argue that men like Isaac Haight acted on their own initiative, driven by local fanaticism that went beyond what Young intended. They note that even John D. Lee, while implicating nearly everyone else, refused to directly testify against Brigham Young in court, stating that Young was not a man of violence. The truth, most likely, lies in the murky gray area in between. Young may never have written a direct, signed order saying, "Kill those people." He was far too shrewd for that. But through his rhetoric, his deputies, and the culture of absolute, unquestioning obedience he fostered, he built the bonfire. Men like Isaac Haight and John D. Lee were simply the ones who dropped the match. He was at the very least morally responsible for the actions of the men who believed they were doing his will. With Lee executed and Brigham Young insulated from blame, the other conspirators largely escaped justice. Isaac Haight, the man who argued for killing the children, died of natural causes in Arizona in 1886 after years on the run. Colonel William Dame, the militia commander who gave the final authorization, suffered a stroke and died in 1884. Major John Higbee, the man who gave the direct order to do your duty on the killing field, also evaded capture and died an old man in 1904, still insisting that the Indians had forced his hand. George A. Smith, the apostle whose visit set the entire murderous plot in motion, died peacefully in Salt Lake City in 1875, before Lee's trials could tarnish his name. The system of justice, manipulated and stalled for 2 decades, ultimately failed. It punished the triggerman, but let the architects of the crime walk free. So what was the final motive? Was it greed for the emigrants' supposed wealth? Was it simple vengeance for the murder of an apostle in Arkansas? Was it wartime hysteria? A preemptive strike against perceived enemies? Or was it religious fanaticism, the ultimate expression of the doctrine of blood atonement? The answer is that it was all of these things. It was a perfect storm of fear, faith, and fury, whipped into a frenzy by leaders who taught their followers that violence in the name of God was not a sin, but a sacrament. The Mountain Meadows Massacre does not stand as an indictment of an entire faith, but as a timeless and horrifying cautionary tale. It reveals the terrifying danger of unchecked power, the poison of radical rhetoric, and the bloody consequences of what happens when men, believing they are on a mission from God, place themselves above the simple laws of human decency. In the end, only one man was executed for the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The other killers, and the leaders who gave the orders, died as free men. The darkest secret of the Mormon War was successfully buried under a single coffin. It's a chilling reminder that the most dangerous lies are the ones people tell themselves when they believe God is on their side. History is full of buried truths. Subscribe and click the bell for more stories they tried to forget.